o ke aloha no ka mea nui, e o mai nā Hawai'i, nā pua, nā lei, nā mamo. Ala mai e ka Lāhui, laula kaulana, o mai ka lehu lehu, ha'aheo o e Hawai'i, ano ai me ke aloha, aloha e. Velina ke aloha, ia o ko pakahi a pau, ia oe e ku kaikua ana i ko hoʻokipa maikai ana ia'u, me ka olu me ka loko maikai. Ia o kou e nā kaikua ana, nā wahine e leu o ke au nei. Ia oe e tania liʻiliʻi i ko kako ana mai, ko kua ana mai. Ia oe e ku upoki'i, ke aloha nui. Ia o kou e nā kunane, nā kāne e noho mai nei, mahalo nui ke ia hui ana o ke ia ohana. Thank you for such a beautiful welcome. And I'm really happy to be here and share some of my research with you folks. This part of my work is looking at identity and how do we identify and define ourselves in this modern context. So I'm going to look at the history of that and the context of Hawaiians within the US colonial framework a little bit, and then look at ways in which our kupuna, our ancestors, defined themselves in a really difficult period, and hopefully the importance of how that plays as we head into our future. And I thought I'd start with some historical background just to kind of make sure everybody understands a little bit about Hawaii. For those of you who were here on Tuesday, this is going to be a bit of a redundant recap, but I think it's important. So, as with you, our kupuna come from the night, from the darkness, born from the sky and the earth. And if we advance quickly over a couple of thousand years, we get to the late 1700s and early 1800s, our first contact with the West, or actually the West's first recording of their contact with us, although we have recordings of previous contact with Westerners. During the late 1700s and 1800s, we had, as with many people, vast and extreme changes in our society due to epidemics, religious conversion, the introduction of a market economy, privatization of our land tenure system in which many Hawaiians were dispossessed of land, and continued political change. 1795, King Kamehameha unites the islands, and it's in 1820. He dies in 1819. I'm sorry, I'm really going, there's a fast forward version of all of this. He dies in 1819, and there's a political as well as a religious vacuum, so to speak, in certain terms. The missionaries arrive a year later and sort of fill in that space. They bring a print press with them, which they use to start to print mostly Bible lessons and eventually the Bible itself in Hawaiian. And they begin teaching literacy to Hawaiians, which we adapted to very quickly. In 1840, a constitutional monarchy is created under Kamehameha III. And in 1842 and 1843, several different nations in the world recognized the independence of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And over the next 50 years, we continue to sign international treaties with these countries, and so Hawaii is a nation among nations of the world, recognized as such. In 1861, nearly 30 years after the presses were established by the missionaries, Hawaiians then moved in and created our own press, took over some of that. Published newspapers so that we could begin to publish the stories that we wanted to know about, our histories from our perspective, as well as news of the world. There was really a censorship of outside information that was controlled by the missionary press. And then in the next 20 years or so, we start to see a lot of articles talking about the Lāhui Hawaii. In simple terms, the Lāhui is a word that gets translated as either nation or people, and that's what I'm going to talk about. But there are a lot of articles that start to compare and contrast what is the Lāhui and Hawaii, and how is it different from the white foreigners who have come in and moved into Hawaii and are changing our ways of being and our ways of life and lifestyle. So there start to be all of these articles saying, this is what the Lāhui Hawaii is, and this is how we behave, this is who we are, and I'm going to get to some of those articles and references. In 1887, our king Kalakaua is forced at gunpoint to sign what is known as the Bayonet Constitution, which limits his monarchical powers. There's a cabinet at that point in time under the king and a legislative body. And the king previously had control over that cabinet. With this new, one of the things with this new constitution is that he can appoint the cabinet, but the legislators can have a vote of no confidence, and they will be released. So it's this sort of ping pong where he has to choose people that he knows that the legislature will confirm. And at the same time, the qualifications for becoming a legislator change. You need to have property qualification and or annual income qualification. So through this process, many Kanaka Maoli, many Hawaiians are out of the process, not able to vote and not able to become a part of the legislature. And then we get to this, Kalakaua dies in 1891. His sister becomes the queen. Her name is Queen Liliuokalani. She attempts to restore the monarchy, the monarchical powers of the sovereign through a new constitution and through events that occurred, which is not the topic of my discussion. The overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom occurs. It's supported by the presence of the US military, supposedly there to protect American property and American lives, and yet they do not set themselves up by the American consulate, which exists at that time, nor near where Americans are living. They set up they billet the soldiers across the street of the palace, which is also sort of kitty corner to the government building, in the name of maintaining peace, even though there was no unrest in the city. This quick chronology sort of runs through 1893 to 1898. 1898 is when we are illegally annexed by the United States. US constitutional law requires that a treaty of annexation be entered into Congress, and that requires a 2/3 vote of Congress. They were unable to get that. Hawaiians sent delegates to US Congress every year after the overthrow. They understood, they were very savvy to lobby against annexation, and they were successful every year. They counted votes, they visited the legislators, they knew how many votes were needed. When they had enough votes, they were sure that the Treaty of Annexation was not going to be ratified, they returned to Hawaii. But later in that year of 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. And rather than a treaty of annexation, a resolution was introduced to the US Congress. A resolution only requires a simple majority vote rather than a 2/3 vote. And it's through the Newlands Resolution that we are annexed to the United States. That goes against US treaty, US constitutional. US law says you cannot annex another country in that manner. You need to have a treaty. So as such, we have no treaty. All we have is this Newlands Resolution and a lot of other legislature, which I'm going to talk about. These other items in between are just various ways that Hawaiians continue to assert our sovereignty. Uluhai Malama in 1894 was a garden that was created. Plants and different forms of plants were planted in the garden with symbolic. Some of them were good kukui for enlightenment, as well as ape. And the articles in the newspaper say that they planted ape so that the mouths of their enemies would itch. It's good stuff. In 1895, they hadn't been successful in the annexation, lobbying at US Congress for annexation. And so they, instead of, because that wasn't going through, they established a republic, supposedly a democratic republic, but still with property qualification and income qualifications. Okay, so let's look at identity and definition of the Lāhui. The real question is, what is a Hawaiian? And unfortunately, there is a difference between a capital Native Hawaiian, for some people, not for me, and a lowercase Native Hawaiian versus a Kanaka Maoli or the Lāhui, as we refer to ourselves. These have to do with race and ethnicity, as well as nationhood, sovereignty, and indigeneity. So here's a look at the differences between race, nation, and ethnicity. And simply put, race is supposed to be genetic categories, a nation is linked to political status, and ethnicity are cultural values and traditions passed to generation. Even in Western sort of thought processes, these are very interlinked and overlapping and problematic. So we have this idea of a race and a nation and an ethnic group. For some people, these are separate. These can be divided, but my argument is that that's not necessarily so for the Hawaiian people. And when we look at our vocabulary and we reference to ourselves and the way we define that, you can kind of see how these are all overlapping and interconnected for us. We have to realize that racial inferiority was an ideology in which it guided and allowed for the expansion of foreign markets and monopolies, exploration and exploitation of natural resources, ideas about savagery, civilization, white supremacy, racial inferiority. All of these come into play in Hawaii and in the United States in general. And so these terms are problematic. Race has an inherent idea of hierarchy and connections of civilization attached to it, ideas about blood quantum. Nations have an idea, for instance, Native Americans never had a nation status, so they're referred to as tribes, and yet inherently they have the same rights to sovereignty. Just because they didn't form themselves in constitutionally as a nation, in a Western format, doesn't mean they don't have the right to sovereignty. So these terms are problematic. Ethnicity is as well, because it's very amorphous. It moves and it shifts and it's different for each individual. It's not like we can contain these ideas. So I started wanting to understand, like I said, there were all these articles in the newspapers about Lāhui, and my research in looking at mele Lāhui, our nationalist songs, made me want to understand, what does this word Lāhui mean? That's how they want to define us, as a race and a nation and ethnicity, but how do we define ourselves? And so I really looked at this word Lāhui. So if we just look at some dictionary definitions, this is one of the earliest published dictionaries of the Hawaiian language in 1865. And you see this sort of temporality of the idea of Lāhui as coming from the word la, a day, and hui, to unite or meet together, a time of coming together. And then in a modern context, it gets related to a nation and a people. Here's another dictionary definition, and we start to see the intersection of nation, race, tribe, and we have these ideas in one word of Lāhui, whereas in English they're really separate and different, overlapping absolutely. So when we look at these three ideas of race, nationhood, and ethnicity, the Lāhui Hawaii sort of encompasses all of them. We get called a race, and yet we had nation-state status, and we have ethnic and cultural practices. Very difficult to separate out. Part of my motivation as well is to understand and to look at the way that we're defined within the US context and within the state of Hawaii. There are many laws and acts that have been enacted to define Hawaiians, and we're going to just quickly run through some of these definitions so you can see how complex it really is. Here's a list of some of the laws enacted at the federal level. There are 150 plus laws which refer to Native Hawaiians, either outlining benefits for Native Hawaiians or some other aspect of our entitlements and rights. So we also have had several court cases in which Hawaiian entitlements, such as OHA. OHA is the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, set up within the state of Hawaii. And it was, the state of Hawaii was sued on the claim that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is a race-based organization, because if Hawaiians are merely a racial category and the US Constitution prevents racism in the 14th and 15th Amendment, then any programs which benefit Native Hawaiians as a race are therefore unconstitutional. And several lawsuits have been taken up. This one, Rice v. Cayetano, went to the US Supreme Court. On one level, we lost it because they voted on decided on a very narrow, on the 15th Amendment only, which is about voting. So it was a 14th and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal access, and the 15th Amendment guarantees rights to vote. So they tried to completely dismantle ʻōha, saying that it benefits Native Hawaiians and that's a racial categorization. The entire office should be dismantled. The Supreme Court found that that it was okay to have the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, but not only Hawaiians can vote for the representatives in ʻōha. So everyone now in the state of Hawaii is allowed to vote for ʻōha. And following that, they tried to say that ʻōha shouldn't be getting money for Native Hawaiians, but that was dismissed. And they've been dismissed by either US district courts or the US Supreme Court in each case. This last one, Arakaki versus Lingle, was an attempt to dismantle the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, which gives land to Hawaiians, homestead land to Hawaiians, and that was also dismissed. But what the Supreme Court said, what the US District Court said though, was that the legislature needs to decide these things. We only, as the courts, we only interpret law. The law is unclear. It needs to go back to Congress. And this one, Moki'ika Cummings versus Kamehameha Schools. Kamehameha Schools is a private school established by an estate from a Hawaiian ali'i, from one of our royalty, for Native Hawaiian children. And a lawsuit was placed by a student who was really a puppet in this whole thing for a non-Hawaiian student to be given entrance to Kamehameha schools. They actually dropped the case for admittance, for the student to be admitted. Kamehameha Schools was worried about losing it and having the whole thing dismantled, so they decided to settle. The attorney, though, for the Moki'ika Cummings is currently looking for new plaintiffs, and they're going to try to do another case. Just recently, Kamehameha accepted another non-Hawaiian student so that they could prevent a lawsuit going through. Basically, they're not saying that publicly, but they can't afford the $10 million or so it'll take them in legal fees to fight it. The Supreme Court has become much more conservative lately, and they're worried that if it goes up, the entire school could be dismantled, or any preference could be removed. So, quickly, we're going to look at a couple of the ways that Native Hawaiians are defined in these legislative acts. In the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920, we see a blood quantum definition. And the verbiage is problematic. You'll start to see how complex it gets. And they define Native Hawaiian as any descendant of not less than 1/2 part of the blood of the races inhabiting the Hawaiian Islands previous to 1778. 1778 is the year Cook came. This is a 50% or more is really what it means. You have to be 50% plus in order to qualify for Hawaiian homelands. Although here it's a capital, because it's the first word in the sentence, within the legislation, all these emphases are mine, just for your information. It's really a lowercase n. In the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, it's a lowercase n, Native Hawaiian, which is 50% or more. Only there. Other parts in this act do refer to this trust responsibility that exists between the United States and Hawaiians. It does refer to Hawaiians as Aboriginal people, indigenous people. This is kind of an interesting section, I think, because it says that the Aboriginal indigenous people retain our inherent sovereign authority and our right to organize for our own welfare. That's kind of big, actually, given that they're trying to limit the ways in which we organize. And then given the fact that they really limit our sovereign authority, and yet here we're guaranteed and recognized as having it. This is State of Hawaii statutes that I brought in. These are currently, this is the current version of it, although it was established in the 1900 Organic Act and has been revised since then. Here, they limit it to the word Hawaiian, and it's any descendant. There's not a blood quantum on this definition. So it's any Hawaiian. A Hawaiian is any descendant of the Aboriginal people. Again, we see words like sovereignty and who subsisted. We have the 1778 date again. In that same section, we also have a definition for a Native Hawaiian, and in the rest of this, they use the capital N, Native Hawaiian. And here again, it's a blood quantum, not less than 1/2 part, meaning 50% or more. And there you see an actual blood quantum reference a little bit lower. Again, ideas of sovereignty and subsistence are included within these definitions. If we look at the apology law, in 1993, Bill Clinton was the president, and that was the 100-year anniversary of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And they graciously apologized for their actions, admitted their illegal actions in the overthrow, admitted the problems of the annexation process, but didn't do anything more than say we're sorry. But we have definitions of Native Hawaiian. Again, here Native Hawaiian is any descendant. So you have these conflicting within the same US legislation, different bodies from 1920 to 1993, except we have laws that define Hawaiians and Native Hawaiians, capital or lower N, in different ways. That's what I think is seriously interesting and kind of stupid and problematic, I guess is a better way to put it. They acknowledge that Hawaiians have never directly relinquished our claims to sovereignty, either through their monarchy or through a plebiscite or referendum, because even when statehood went through, there was no plebiscite held. Hawaiians were never asked whether we wanted to be a state of the United States. We've never given up our sovereignty, and they acknowledge that. We've never given up any of our land. It's all been taken illegally, and they acknowledge that, but they don't give it back. They just say, you have our permission to figure it out, kind of. They acknowledge that they took 1.8 million acres of crown lands and public lands without consent or compensation to the Native Hawaiian people. These are ceded lands that we continue to fight for. Just recently, there was another lawsuit because the state of Hawaii started to try to sell these lands to private development, and it was stopped. And then what the legislature, the state of Hawaii legislature did was say that they'd have to have 2/3 vote of the legislature in order to sell ceded lands. And that law was passed in the state of Hawaii last year. So prior to that, it was a simple majority, that 51% of them, kind of similar to the annexation situation, they would be able to sell it. And now it's 2/3, which they say will be very difficult to get, but in a difficult economic times, I'm sure 2/3 of them will say, okay. And then here we have the actual apology statement in which they apologize on behalf of the United States for the overthrow and for their role of it, the participation of their agents and their military, and the deprivation of our rights to self-determination, even though the US Constitution guarantees the right to independence and sovereignty. If you jump up to 2002, here's a really good definition actually, because it has multiple levels. It's still problematic, but at least we have a political recognition as a nation, as an internationally recognized nation. It says that Hawaiians have a cultural and historic and land-based link. That, again, we've never relinquished our sovereignty. This is an important statement because it clearly says that we're not given these rights because of a race. It says it's not because we are in a race. These services are not extended to us because we're a race, but because of our unique status as an indigenous people and a sovereign nation. So it's a political, historical status rather than a racial one, which is really important given what I said about the 14th and 15th amendments to the Constitution. So that's sort of what we're dealing with on the outside and the complexities of that. The final part of this, which I guess I don't have one here, I'll talk about it in a little bit more, is that right now there's a bill within the US Congress called the Akaka bill on one level. It's actually this year's one is a bill pertaining to the Native Hawaiian Reorganization Act. And they would recognize us as a Native indigenous people, although they've already done that many times in other legislation. And we would create what would be called a governing entity. That's what it's not a government, it's a governing entity. It will require us to come up with definitions of citizenship for other Native peoples within the US context that has always meant blood quantum. And so we'll have to conceivably figure out a blood quantum definition for who can be a citizen. And I'm really not looking forward to that process. So we'll see what happens. It hasn't gone through yet. Bush opposed it, and I'm certainly not a fan of George W. Bush, and he opposed it for the wrong reasons, but at least he was against it. Obama has said that he'll sign it. And it'll put us into a mess of deciding, do you engage in the conversation and the process, or do you choose to be left out? And we'll see. I don't know right now my decision is to stay out, but I'm not sure what I'll do when it's actually here. I'm not sure. So anyways, back to my research. Between 1893 and 1898, over 300 mele Lāhui songs for the Lāhui were published in Hawaiian language newspapers. I've been looking at this work for the past almost 20 years, since 1993, since that 100-year anniversary, and collected over 300 of these mele from the Hawaiian language newspapers and books that were published. I've worked on it for both my master's thesis and my PhD, looking at various aspects of them. My methodology is encapsulated in this olelo no ea, a proverb from our kupuna, which says, "Ahua apane kawaha he ho'olono ko'unei." This is actually used as a challenge in a riddling competition. And for me, the challenge is to understand and to be the listener to the voices of my kupuna, and to try to understand how we would define the Lāhui. This is how the United States has determined to do it, through racial categorizations and nationhood ideas and ethnic practices. But how would we do it in our own language, in our own context? And so that's really more about what my work is about. So language is central. I try to look at explanations in songs as well as in just stories, and like I said, in the 1860s to the 1880s, there were all of these stories and articles published in the newspaper saying, this is what the Lāhui Hawai'i is like. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. Before I do so, though, we need to look at translation and understand that translation into English carries its own cultural connotations, and that we have to be careful of assuming that a word in English, like royalty, is the same in Hawaiian as it is in English and with Western society, especially in the United States, who was formed against a monarchical system of Great Britain. Ali'i and royalty are not, well regarded. They're seen as an oppressive system. But we had a different understanding and a different relationship with our ali'i. It's important to know that there are multiple meanings, and that Hawaiian writers didn't necessarily mean one over the other. I would say that they meant all of them. So, for instance, the word Lāhui, I want you to think of it in the broad context of having meanings of sovereignty and nationhood, as well as the people. So within the references that I make reference to, I'm not going to translate the word Lāhui. I'm just going to leave it there. So hopefully force you to kind of keep that broad. Otherwise, I got to go race/people/nation/whatever. And I think this is important because it's just important that we understand and identify and define ourselves for ourselves, and not as others want to define us. So one of these, I've gathered, I would say close to 100 references to the Lāhui, and when I sort of put them into piles of how I saw them, there were three piles, three categorizations, or three sort of common definers. The first of which is the idea of history, song, and genealogy as identifiers of the Lāhui. You guys can read the English, and I'm going to read the Hawaiian. I hope you can read it. Yeah, I think you can. These are important to note that they change over time. Pele is our goddess of the volcano. And she was a newcomer to Hawai'i. She wasn't born there. She came there from Kahiki, from Pola Pola, with her family, and this is a description of their arrival. Wa olelo ia he ohana nui o Pele a me kona mo ke keina, a me kona mo ke kunane. Wa paia e lako ma ka mokupuni o Hawai'i I ka wā kahiko. O Pele ke ali ia pau o ke ia ohana a me na kanaka malalo ona. A wa ho'okahua iho ko lako noho ana ma ke alo o Mauna Loa. Wuku e aku na kamaaina, a ka no ka ikaika o kia poe, o lana kila lako, maluna o na kamaaina, a mamuli o ka ui o na wahine o ke ia Lāhui, a me na kāne, o ho'oki pu I hola ke ku e o na kamaaina I ka poe malihini. It's long, and there's several long quotes coming up, but I wanted to leave them because you'll see the similarities in names and places and people that I think is very important. Here, Pele, her family is referred to as a Lāhui, as a people, a nation. And it's interesting that we see what we see as individual family names then over time gets associated with all of the Hawaiian people across the archipelago. This is a song, this is a mele for Kaui Keoli. He was King Kamehameha III, who reigned in the 1840s. And it's a genealogical chant. I haven't translated the whole thing, but at the end, we see this line, Ho'owahine ho'okane ana ke aloha. It is love that makes them like a man and a woman to each other, referring to his ancestors. Ho'i'i ēnei I Lāhui ai. They have returned to this place to create a Lāhui of their descendants. Here's another genealogical reference where we see recounted the parents, the behaviors of these ali'i, and then at the end see them referred to as a Lāhui. This one is really interesting if you look at the last line, Loa'a mai ka Lāhui I kapa ia he mahi. This is interesting for Hawaiians because the mahi becomes a genealogical line and is not really thought of as a Lāhui in and of themselves. So there was a time at which there were many Lāhui in Hawaii, but over time that changed and we began to see ourselves as united, as one. We still see island differentiations and genealogical differentiations are still made, but we start to differentiate more about us versus the other who comes and impacts our world. Here's another one. Ua olelo ia mai ma ko Hawai'i nei mau mo'opuku au hau kupuna na kanaka mua o Hawai'i nei. No lako mai ko Hawai'i nei Lāhui kanaka apau. It's from our ancestors that we create a Lāhui Hawaii. So we start to see it's still a genealogical reference, but it's a broader one, not to a specific family, but back to Papa and Wakea. I'm gonna skip this one. So the next category of definition that became really apparent was cultural practice, and how our cultural practices and values were really different from the people who came to Hawaii. Basically, haole, you start to see this. Haole is our word for an American or a European, a white foreigner. And we start to see all of these definitions and trying to understand this is how they act and how they behave, and this is what we value as important. So this one says, He Lāhui ho'okama ku'u Lāhui. Wa ho'okama nā li'i nā keikia nā li'i, o wa ho'okama nā li'i nā keikia nā aikane, a me nā punahele, a me nā maka'ainana. A pela ho'i ka po'e ko'i a me nā maka'ainana. A wa ho'i ho'ohio aku I mau aikane, I mau punahele, I mau halikipa. He vai lave vale, he ai vale, he I lalau vale, he kapa a ahu vale, a he nui vale o nā ano o keia mau hana ho'aloha I loko kia mau hana ho'omaka. Basically, we're very generous. If we have food, we will feed you. If we have clothing, we will give it to you. We don't have an idea of stockpiling resources. It's a sharing. Through mutual giving and sharing is how we take care of each other. This is a reference to our again, cultural practices of prayer, how important prayer is to us, and how that differs a little bit. And again, we have this, he ha'avivali na mea aya me na mea a'ahu. Give food and share food amongst our people. Letting people come into our house. The last line is the most interesting to me. He Lāhui hila I ka pie piele. When you look at pie piele in the dictionary, it's to trade or barter. In our modern context, we don't think of that as a negative thing. But for Hawaiians it's a thing to be stingy, to try to say like what I have is worth this much and I'm going to get as much as I can out of you in terms of money. That is not considered a value. It's something to be ashamed of. Of course, this is one of my favorites. Hawaii no ka po'e Hawaii, Lāhui Hawaii, Aina Hawaii, Aupuni Hawaii, Olelo Hawaii. That's not my emphasis. That capitalization is in the original newspaper article. Speaking about the importance of our cultural practices for our children, there's the debate going on here is a push to educate children only in English and not have them learn Hawaiian anymore. And this author is saying, We're Hawaiian because we speak Hawaiian. And that's it. That's all we need to know. We can learn other languages, but our kids need to speak Hawaiian. The last one category that I looked at and sort of identified was this idea of life and breath and sovereignty, independence, and the way that that gets connected to the Lāhui. In the 1860s, this is before the Bayonet Constitution, before it limits the powers of the king, there's a debate that gets brought up in the newspapers. This is in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser. It's an English newspaper. And the article reads, "The representatives of the people should be men of intelligence, firmness, and independence, who have no favors to ask from the ministry." Hawaiians were always accused of favoritism and being friends, and that's how they got things through. But that's how Congress and the legislature works, is exactly through that kind of a system. Who are willing to bear opprobrium for doing what they believe to be right. That opprobrium word, anybody know what that word means? I had to look it up myself. It means they're willing to be shamed. They're willing to do whatever they have to do in order to make the right decisions. Though it be in direct opposition of the ministry, which is the cabinet. When there are natives who have shown these requisite qualities of representatives, they should be nominated and chosen. Sounds good, but there's that caveat, only if they understand how this system should work. And in the next paragraph, we get really what they're saying. But the interests of foreigners are increasing every year so rapidly that it is right and proper that the people should be represented as far as possible by foreigners. We mean only by such as have lived here long enough to become fully identified with the people, their interests, and progress. Well, it depends on how you identify their interests and their progress, right? And in the next, this is at the end of 1867, and then in early 1868, it continues on. But who is to do it? Meaning, who is to legislate? Ought not men who have staked their fortunes largely to the country to have a voice in the matter? Most certainly, and this can most readily be done by the choice of competent representatives. Foreigners, whenever they can be had, should be chosen. They have studied these things, they know more their operation, and can legislate more discreetly. This was talking about economy, talking about land, privatized land tenure, and governance. I talked about this on Tuesday, and here we see an example. You did not have to be a citizen of the Hawaiian Kingdom to be elected into the legislature, which is like kind of crazy. And well, this is what they're pushing for. I should say change that. It's not so true yet, but it's going to become true in the 1887 Constitution that you don't have to be a citizen. So this person argues, it is no argument to say that because a man does not choose to take the oath of allegiance, meaning to become a citizen and pledge allegiance to the kingdom, therefore his mouth must be closed and he has no right to express his views on politics. If he is domiciled here, if he is an owner of real and personal property, if, in a word, he chooses this country for his home, even though he does not want to be a citizen, he has every right to take part in the politics of the country, to express his sentiments freely, pro and con, on every measure that affects his individual interests or the public weal. Oh, there we go. This is a Hawaiian language newspaper, Kanupepa Ku'oko'a. However, it goes back and forth, but quite often it's not pro-Hawaiian independence in voice. It's in Hawaiian, and a woman who wrote an excellent book about the Hawaiian newspaper history. In speaking about the editor, the founder of this newspaper, she said that he was a descendant of a missionary, and while he loved Hawaiians, while he loved Hawaiian language, he spoke Hawaiian, he didn't love the Hawaiian people. He didn't look to Hawaii as his country of origin. He was educated in the United States, and it's there that his loyalties lie. So this is an article in Hawaiian, so you have to be careful, even when you're reading Hawaiian language sources, not to assume that they're sort of quote-unquote pro-Hawaiian in perspective. And we get this idea of waiu momona, this sweet and fat milk, and sometimes it's referred to as the milk and honey, which is that reference to wealth. And the newspaper article wrote, "Ua waiho ka waiu momona me ka wā kahiko mai. A ole na e nā kanaka I hapaiae a ho'okomo I loko o ko lako mau pakeke pono I. A he ahalaka hewa nui o nā haole.
O iai, o ike lako, a ole I ui naka maoli I ka wai mamona o ka aina, ano leila, hele maila lako, me ko lako moni, me ka ho'ana awau, a kuhi maila lako I ke ano o ka hana ano. Yeah, see these Hawaiians, there's all this beautiful land. If you've ever been to Hawaii, it's beautiful. But their perception was that we weren't using it properly because we didn't use it to make profit. We didn't use it, we grew food to feed our people. We didn't grow food to sell and so, you know, why should they be blamed? Because they saw that we were just wasting all of our resources and they came along and put them in their pockets. It's kind of funny because the word pakeke can either be in their buckets or in their pockets. I'm not sure, because if it's milk, does it go in a bucket? But if you're talking about money, I think it goes in your pocket. So I left them both as a, oh, wait, sorry. This is Ko Hawai'i Pono'i is actually the pseudonym of the author. Ko Hawai'i Pono'i is, means Hawaii's own. And there starts to become this push that Hawaii's own people take care of its own. And so he doesn't, I'm assuming that this is a pseudonym. It's not written like a Hawaiian name. The way it's referred to as Ko Hawai'i Pono'i, meaning all of Hawaii. It's sort of a pseudonym for all of Hawaii's people in a way. He's sort of representing them. He says, Ke ha'a kona mai nei na e na po'e haole nei I ka vai ka o lako. No hea ko lako vai. Hele mai anei lako me ka hiki mai me ko lako vai a ole. E koho iho kako I ka po'e o ko kako koko pono'i, e ku kako I luna, a e ho'ike ia kako iho. He po'e I ike I ka mālama ana I ko kako pono iho. This part, the dot there is actually, you know, he talks about the fact that they come here with their wealth. They didn't, right? They were poor. The missionaries, when they came, didn't have any money. They had very little clothes on their back, and that's the dot that's missing. I need to get it back in here. I shortened it for another presentation. And it describes the way that if it not for the Hawaiian people, they wouldn't have had clothes to wear when they first got here. If not for the Hawaiian people, they wouldn't have food to eat because they didn't know how to farm on our land. We fed them, we gave them houses, we gave them food, we gave them clothing. This actually, I have these two slides out of order, the previous one. This one was actually written first by the same author. It became this debate and they sort of ping-ponged it back and forth. They would write in their newspaper and he would write in his, but it's really a conversation between them. So this is his, actually this is his first write. This is his first article where he says, E makaala kako e nā kanaka Hawai'i, a e koho mana kanaka maoli wale no. Ka po'e I ike maoli I ko kako ano, a me ke ano mau o ko kako noho ana. I think this is an important distinction. He's not saying just because you're Hawaiian, you're qualified. But the fact that you're Hawaiian means you know what we value. You know how to live here. You know what we think should be going on in our aina, and that's why you should choose Hawaiians. So basically, in conclusion, we have these three definitions of Hawaiian. This idea of our genealogy and our history and our mele, our cultural values and our cultural practices, as well as our ability to control our own sovereignty and to make our own decisions for ourselves. For me, these are the things that need to go in our definition of Hawaiian. Because if federal recognition is passed, we'll have to make a decision. We might be forced to do so based on blood quantum, but hopefully we can also include ideas about and knowledge about our genealogy. Genealogy is we've also often been accused that genealogy is just a different way of saying race. It's just a replacement for race. That's been the criticisms that we've heard. But as you know, genealogy and race, they are not the same. They're really different. And so I hope that genealogy will be a part of that, not a blood quantum system, as well as our history and our political status and our cultural practices, so that we can have a different kind of holistic view of ourselves.